Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland smells like institutional bleach and recycled air, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical prayer over linoleum that squeaks under soft-soled shoes. Danielle Ross pushes through the employee entrance at 6:28 a.m., 15 minutes before her shift officially begins, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that makes people forget they've seen her pass. The locker room is empty. Good. She opens her locker, number 247, same one for 8 years, and stares at the pair of worn combat boots sitting on the top shelf. The leather is cracked. The laces are frayed. One boot has a small dent in the heel from a ricochet she doesn't talk about. She reaches up and touches the cracked leather once. Just once. Her fingers linger on the stitching, tracing the wear pattern like reading Braille. 20 years ago, those boots walked through Marjah, Afghanistan. 20 years ago, she was someone else. Someone whose official file doesn't exist. Someone the Pentagon paid $4.2 million to erase from records. Now she's just the quiet nurse on the trauma unit who never raises her voice and never says no. Danielle pulls on her scrubs, navy blue, size small, the fabric soft from 847 washings, and her white compression socks that keep the swelling down in her feet. A faint scar runs from her right collarbone into her collar where shrapnel from an IED never quite came out. The X-rays at Sacred Heart show nothing. Her file shows nothing. Her past shows nothing. That's how it's supposed to be. The hallway outside the locker room connects to the main corridor of the trauma unit. It's 6:35 a.m. now. The nursing staff is arriving in clusters, 2 night shift nurses heading out, 3 day shift nurses heading in. Danielle nods at Jennifer Chen, one of the RNs she's worked alongside since 2016. Jennifer smiles back but doesn't stop to chat. Nobody stops to chat with Danielle Ross. She doesn't present as someone worth talking to. Her shoulders are slightly hunched. Her voice is soft, apologetic, threading toward deferential in a way she's learned perfects the invisibility. Yes, doctor. Of course, doctor. I'll handle that right away, doctor. It's a performance she's been rehearsing for 2,922 days. The hunched shoulders are intentional. The downcast eyes are calculated. A woman who made herself small is a woman who stays off radar. A woman off radar stays alive. The morning huddle happens at 7:41 a.m. sharp in the break room. 10 people, 5 nurses, 2 resident physicians, 1 attending, Dr. Marcus Sterling, the new chief of surgery, and 2 nurse practitioners. The attending used to be Dr. Hayes, who was comfortable and quiet and let people work. Dr. Marcus Sterling arrived 3 months ago from Johns Hopkins with a pedigree you could trace to old money and a network of board connections that made the hospital administration move faster than they should. His shoes are Italian. His watch is a Patek Philippe worth $23,400. His voice sounds like a tank idling in a garage, low, heavy, loaded with authority that doesn't require raising volume. Danielle sits in the back chair, coffee cooling in her hands, the steam rising past her eyes so she's looking down at the table. This is the position. Back corner. Eyes down. Invisible enough to think but visible enough to be called on if something needs doing. Morning update, Sterling says, clicking his pen. Trauma cases from overnight. Room 312, blunt force abdominal injury, headed to OR at 0800. Room 328, multi-system polytrauma, stable but ICU-bound by noon. He pauses, and his eyes pass over the group like a superintendent inspecting property. Room 347, post-op day 2, shrapnel extraction, Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant Brennan. Routine recovery. Wound care at 0700. Danielle's hand doesn't flinch on her coffee cup. But something in her chest tightens. 347, her assignment. A young man with nightmares and anxiety according to the night notes. She hasn't looked at his face yet. She won't. Looking at faces is how you remember things. Remembering things is how you put operational security at risk. Sterling continues through the roster, 3 more cases, 2 planned procedures, one consult waiting on imaging. His voice never changes pitch. He's describing human beings the way he might describe equipment inventory. There's something unsettling about it, though nobody says that out loud. Nobody interrupts Dr. Sterling. Before we disperse, Sterling says, and that's when the timbre of the room changes. The attending physician has decided to stay focused on something. I want to address wound care protocols. We've had some inconsistency on the unit. Some staff members applying outdated techniques that I find concerning. Danielle takes a breath. Small. Controlled. The kind of breath that comes from a decade and a half of holding still while people make decisions about whether you live or die. Specifically, Sterling says, the CDC updated pressure dressing standards in 2019. Not 2018, not 2015. 2019, certain staff members appear to still be using the older protocol. That suggests either inadequate education or deliberate refusal to update. His eyes move through the room and land on Danielle for exactly 2 seconds. We'll be doing a refresher training Thursday evening. Mandatory attendance for anyone whose documentation shows substandard adherence. Substandard. That word lands with intention. Jennifer Chen shifts in her seat. Dr. Rahid, one of the residents, looks uncomfortable. Nobody looks at Danielle. That's how you survive in hierarchies. You don't witness the strikes because if you don't witness them, you don't have to decide whether to help. Self-preservation is a silent act. Danielle sets her coffee down. The mug makes a soft clicking sound on the table. I attended the 2019 CDC update workshop, she says quietly. The pressure dressing protocol I'm using is from the September 2019 recommendation. 4-layer approach with gradient compression, initiation at the wound margin, extension 2 inches beyond hemorrhage control. The room goes very still. You don't correct Dr. Sterling. That's not the hierarchy. The hierarchy is, he makes declarations and you accept them or fail quietly. Sterling turns his full attention toward her. His expression doesn't change, but something shifts in the room's air pressure. Is that so? Yes, doctor. Then perhaps you can explain to Dr. Rahid why your application in room 314 yesterday used 5 layers instead of 4. Sterling flips through a chart in his hands. He has documentation. He's prepared. I reviewed your dressing change at 1,430 hours. 5 layers. The most recent guidance is explicit about the 4-layer protocol. Danielle doesn't look up from her coffee. The patient in 314 had compromised skin integrity on 3 sides of the wound. The 5th layer was a protective barrier against cross-contamination. CDC guidance allows for modification based on individual presentation. It allows for modification, Sterling repeats, in the judgment of physicians. Not nurses. There it is. The steel underneath the words. Nurses don't make judgments. Nurses follow protocols and defer to doctors and don't think they're qualified to assess skin integrity. The room is very quiet now. Danielle can hear the ventilation system humming, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a sound like 1,000 insects trapped in plastic. Her hands are steady on the table. No trembling. No heat in her face. She's been trained for environments where showing emotion gets you killed. A hospital break room is a coffee break by comparison. I can provide the 2019 citation, Danielle says, still not looking up. And the skin assessment that justified the modification. I documented it in her chart at 1,432 hours. Sterling stares at her for 3 seconds. His jaw clocks once, like he's grinding something down. Then he says, that will be all, people, and closes the folder. Morning assignment on the board. Get moving. Jennifer touches Danielle's arm as everyone disperses. Just a quick touch, the kind that says asterisk I saw that and I'm sorry asterisk, but she doesn't stay. Nobody stays. Staying with Danielle marks you as someone who might also be undermining the hierarchy, and nobody wants that. By 6:50 a.m., Danielle is in room 347, pulling on her second pair of gloves of the morning. The chart says Staff Sergeant Lucas Brennan, 26 years old, admitted post-op day 2 following IED-related shrapnel extraction from the right anterior thigh and abdominal wall. Nighttime pain management at 2,200 hours and 0400 hours. Vitals stable. Anxiety notation in the psychological section. No visitors listed. No emergency contact except a mother in Salem, 43 miles away. She hasn't looked at his face yet. The chart is enough. The chart tells the story she needs to know: young Marine, wounded in service, recovering from surgery, requiring wound care and observation. That's all she needs. The room is quiet, machines beeping in that gentle, monitoring way, the ventilation pushing air that smells faintly of antiseptic and the metallic undertone of blood, even hours post-op. His monitors show a heart rate of 76, blood pressure holding steady at 118/72, oxygen saturation at 98% on room air. Excellent vitals. Good recovery trajectory. Danielle opens the dressing on his left thigh where the shrapnel had torn through muscle and fascia. The surgical wound is clean. The stitching is precise. The 4-layer pressure dressing she applied yesterday is holding its gradient perfectly, no seeping, no sign of infection. Sterling was wrong about the 5 layers. The modification saved her from a hematoma yesterday afternoon. But she won't bring that up. Winning arguments with surgeons is not a career strategy. She's focused on the wound, running her eye along the suture line, checking for erythema or warmth when he moves. A small shift in the bed. His breathing changes. She looks up without thinking, just automatic. You check consciousness status when a patient's respiration changes, and she sees his eyes opening. His eyes are brown. Dark. Confused for a moment, the way people are when they're waking up in a hospital bed and their brain is still assembling what happened. And then he focuses. Danielle sees the moment of recognition happen in real time. She watches his pupils dilate and his breath catch. His right hand twitches, and for a second she thinks he's going to reach for her, but then he stops himself. Just stops. Freezes. The way you freeze when you see something you're absolutely certain you've seen before but your brain is refusing to process it. "Morning, Sergeant," Danielle says quietly, keeping her voice professional and even. "Checking your wound. You're healing well." She finishes her assessment, the dressing is exactly as it should be, and starts to chart his status on the tablet. Movement, vital checks, wound assessment, pain level. All the clinical distance she needs. But she can feel his eyes on her. She doesn't look back at him. That's the only way to do this. Don't look. Don't acknowledge. Don't let the past walk back into the present where it has no business being. "You're the night nurse," he says. His voice is rough. Still under anesthesia's effects, maybe. Or just the sound of someone whose chest hasn't forgotten what it means to be hit. "Day shift," Danielle replies. "I'll be your primary through my shift. Anything you need, pain management, food, assistance with mobility, you use the call button." She's already turning to leave. This is the exit. This is where she walks out and becomes the background of his recovery, the competent woman whose name he won't remember, whose face he'll forget by discharge. That's the safest place to be. But then Dr. Sterling's voice comes from the hallway. Sharp. Deliberate. "Miss Ross." A word. Danielle sets the tablet down on the chair next to Brennan's bed and steps out. Sterling is standing in the corridor, his arms crossed, his expression arranged in a way that suggests his plan this moment. Behind him, Jennifer Chen is hurrying past, eyes forward, and Dr. Rahid is pretending to review a chart in room 349. "Your wound care technique," Sterling says quietly, "needs re-evaluation. I'm assigning a formal observation period. Dr. Rahid will be shadowing you for the next 3 shifts. Consider it a learning opportunity." Danielle's hands are empty. No trembling. Her voice comes out level. "Yes, doctor." And maybe use this time to familiarize yourself with current protocols. Just a thought. He turns and walks toward the attending desk, leaving her standing in the middle of the hallway. That's when the real campaign begins. Not the harsh words. This is different. This is systematic. This is a man who's decided you're a problem that requires strategic dismantling. Danielle looks back toward room 347. Staff Sergeant Brennan is watching from his bed, his eyes still confused, still searching. She looks away. She has no idea yet that he recognized her. She has no idea yet that he was 8 years old the last time he saw her face, and he's spent 20 years hoping he'd see it again. She has no idea that his nightmares aren't about combat, they're about a woman in military gear pulling him from rubble in Marjah while explosions bloomed orange in the darkness behind them. She has no idea that he's decorated now, that he carries medals in his service record, all of them tied to the fact that he survived Marjah alive because someone pulled him out. All she knows is that Dr. Sterling has just drawn a line in the sand. All she knows is that she's about to become the thing he's already decided she should be, have a problem that needs solving. And that's when her phone vibrates in her pocket. She ignores it. Phones are for people who have outside lives, and Danielle stopped having an outside life 20 years ago when she walked into an operation that was supposed to be surgical, precise, and absolutely off the books. But that vibration is about to matter. Room 512 smelled like antiseptic and something else, gratitude. Mrs. Chen lay on the hospital bed, her daughter holding her hand, both of them watching Danielle unwrap the abdominal wound dressing with the careful precision of someone who understood that every layer mattered. The daughter smiled. A real smile. The kind that said thank you without words. Danielle had changed this dressing for 3 days straight, and the wound was healing exactly as it should, clean edges, pink granulation tissue, no signs of infection. Mrs. Chen's trust was palpable, like a weight she carried with both hands. The door opened. Dr. Sterling filled the doorway the way certain men do, as though the space had been waiting for him. Chief of Surgery. Johns Hopkins pedigree. Board connections that extended into rooms Danielle would never enter. His eyes moved across the scene, the patient, the daughter, the dressing Danielle had just placed, and something in his expression shifted. Not concern. Assessment. The kind a predator makes before deciding whether to feed. Nurse Ross, he said, his voice carrying the particular texture of a man accustomed to obedience. Is that really how you were trained to perform wound care? Danielle looked up, hand still gloved, finger steady. I'm following the updated protocol from. It's substandard. He stepped closer, not hurried, each footfall deliberate. Mrs. Chen deserves better than whatever shortcuts you learned. Start over. Properly. The daughter's smile died. Danielle saw it happen, the confusion blooming across her face as she watched the doctor speak to the nurse as though the nurse were a medical student who'd failed an exam. As though the woman who'd been caring for her mother, whose hands had been gentle and whose voice had been patient for 72 hours, had somehow been doing it wrong all along. Danielle unwrapped the dressing she'd just placed. Her jaw tightened, a single muscle, no more. Controlled. She began again while Sterling watched with an expression of theatrical disappointment, as though witnessing a performance that had fallen short of a mediocre standard. The daughter squeezed her mother's hand. Neither of them spoke. The room had become something else entirely, not a healing space anymore, but a stage where competence was being publicly questioned by someone who'd spent 30 seconds examining the work of someone who'd spent 3 days understanding it. When Danielle finished, Sterling nodded once, the gesture containing no acknowledgement of correctness, only the absence of further criticism. He left without speaking to the patient. 2 days later, the break room was alive with sound. For nurses and a resident clustered around the coffee station, laughter rolling between them like something tangible. Someone had told a story about a patient's family member asking if the hospital had a better doctor available. The laughter was real. The kind that came from people who'd survived another shift. Danielle entered, pulled her lunch from the refrigerator, and sat at the corner table where she always sat. She opened her sandwich. The laughter stopped. One by one, they collected their cups. One by one, they left. No words exchanged. No eye contact. Just the sound of chairs pushing back from the table, the quiet clink of ceramic against the sink, and the soft whoosh of the door closing. Within 90 seconds, she was alone. The sandwich sat in front of her. The coffee in her abandoned cup was still steaming. She took one measured breath and stared at the empty chairs, at the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in glass, at the window that looked out onto the Portland rain beginning to fall. She ate the sandwich anyway. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, the unit board held a new edition. A formal write-up, printed in Times New Roman, her name highlighted in red marker so vivid it looked like a wound. Ross, D., policy violation, failed to document patient education per standard for point 7.2. Second violation will result in suspension. The violation was fabricated. Danielle had documented it at 1847 hours, the entry timestamped and signed. But the write-up didn't reference that. The write-up existed only to be seen, to be commented on, to sit on that board like evidence of incompetence. She stood before it for 10 seconds while 3 nurses walked past, eyes down. None of them looked at her. All of them looked at the red highlighted name. Sterling had understood something fundamental: humiliation worked best when it was public. When witnesses could testify to it. When the target had to continue working beside the people who'd seen her diminished. Thursday came with rain hammering the parking lot like applause. Danielle was restocking supplies in the hallway outside the supply room when Sterling rounded the corner, his white coat trailing behind him like the robe of something ancient and entitled. He didn't approach directly. He cornered her, positioned himself between her and the supply room door, his body language communicating that she was trapped in the conversation whether she participated or not. "You need to understand something, Nurse Ross." His voice was low, sharp, the kind of tone reserved for people he'd decided didn't deserve volume. "This unit has standards. Excellence. A pedigree. You're adequate at best. Adequate doesn't belong at Sacred Heart." The words landed like they were meant to. Like they were constructed specifically to convey that her presence here was an error, a mistake that time would eventually correct. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't feel it coming. It simply appeared, the kind of tear that comes from exhaustion and a body betraying its own discipline. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but every word was sharp as a blade. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Doctor." Sterling laughed. A short, dismissive sound. The laugh of a man who'd won. He walked away, and Danielle leaned against the wall for 5 seconds, just 5, then returned to her shift. But the tear had changed something. Or maybe it had revealed what was already there. That evening, her daughter asked about it. Danielle sat at the kitchen table at 1407 hours, and her 7-year-old stood in the doorway with confusion written across her face like a question she didn't have the words to ask. "Mommy, why are you crying?" The question was simple. The answer was impossible. How could she explain that she'd been invisible for 20 years? That the moment you surfaced, the moment anyone looked too closely, everything collapsed? That she'd built a life on the foundation of not existing, and now someone was systematically dismantling that foundation in front of witnesses? That the combat boots in her locker, the ones with sand still embedded in the laces, the ones from Marjah, represented a woman who no longer had the legal right to exist? Danielle pulled her daughter close and held her without answering. The silence between them was heavy with all the things mothers aren't supposed to carry alone. Outside, Portland rain continued its percussion against the windows. Inside, a woman who'd held dying men in her arms discovered that she had no words for holding her own daughter while everything came apart. The phone on the counter vibrated. Once. Twice. Then again. Messages. Texts. Something was moving in the background of her life, like currents beneath the surface. She didn't check them. Not yet. But she could feel the momentum building, the sense that something was about to happen that would force her to choose between remaining invisible or stepping into the light. And in that kitchen, holding her daughter while the rain hammered Portland like a warning, Danielle understood that the choice had already been made for her. The waiting room at Sacred Heart erupted into chaos at 1420 hours on Tuesday afternoon. A man came through the emergency entrance, 6'7", 280 pounds of rage wrapped in a blood-stained jacket, screaming for the doctor who killed his brother. His voice shattered the fluorescent-lit calm like a hammer through glass. He had a pistol, .45 caliber, and he was swinging it in wide, desperate arcs, his hand shaking with something deeper than anger. Grief. Raw, unfiltered grief. The waiting room scattered like startled birds. A mother grabbed her child and dove behind a plastic chair. An elderly man pressed himself against the wall, wheezing. A nurse dropped her tablet and bolted toward the back hallway. Someone hit the panic alarm. Within 5 seconds, the ER had transformed from organized chaos to panicked exodus. Feet pounded tile. Someone knocked over a coffee station and didn't look back. Danielle Ross was restocking the suture cart when the screaming started. She heard the crack of his voice. "Where is he? Where's Dr. Sterling? I'm going to put a bullet in his chest the same way he put one in mine." And she paused. Her hand stilled on the gauze rolls. Around her, staff moved in predictable patterns. The medical student ran. The respiratory therapist backed away. The trauma surgeon locked himself in his office. Fight or flight kicked in across the entire department. Everyone ran. Danielle set down the gauze and walked toward him. Not quickly. Not with urgency. She walked with the kind of measured, deliberate pace that belonged to someone who had walked through gunfire in Marjah, who had moved through firefights with a clarity that could only come from having already accepted that death was a possibility. Her hands were visible. Her breathing was controlled. She moved across the ER floor like someone walking into a room where she already knew everyone's name. The gunman saw her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, his arm wavered. The pistol dipped slightly. He wasn't expecting someone to walk toward him. He was expecting screaming, running, resistance. Not this. "What's your name?" Danielle's voice had dropped. It wasn't the careful, deferential tone she'd been using for 8 years at Sacred Heart. This was different. This was the voice she'd used in Marjah when a 19-year-old with a sucking chest wound was panicking and needed someone to tell him he wasn't going to die. The voice that came from somewhere deeper than fear. "Your name?" "Marcus." His grip loosened fractionally. "My brother's name was Daniel." "Tell me about Daniel." Danielle kept walking. 10 feet. 8 feet. 6 feet. Each step deliberate and calm, the way a trainer approaches a panicked horse. "What did he like to do?" Marcus's voice cracked. He wanted to be an architect. He was going to build hospitals that didn't look like prisons. He was 23. "Was going to," Danielle said, and there was something in her tone that wasn't sympathy but recognition. The recognition of someone who had held dying men's hands and heard them talk about what they were never going to do. She was 3 feet away now. "When did you lose him?" 2 months. His arm was shaking worse now, but it wasn't from rage. It was from something breaking inside him, something that had probably been breaking since the moment he found out. He went to the hospital. Said it was chest pain. They told him it was heartburn. 3 days later, he collapsed. They said it was too late. Danielle nodded once. She'd seen this before, anger at doctors because anger was easier than grief, easier than acknowledging that sometimes the human body fails in ways that can't be fixed. Sometimes the smartest doctor in the world can't save you. "You're in pain right now," Danielle said quietly. "Not just your heart. Your body." "Let me look." Marcus stared at her. The pistol lowered another inch. "Let me help," she said. It wasn't a request. It was the kind of statement that came with the weight of someone who had never asked for permission to save a life. "Put the gun down." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Marcus's knees buckled. The adrenaline that had been holding him up evaporated, and his body simply folded. Danielle caught his elbow and guided him to the floor with the same steady hand that had pulled a child from rubble in Afghanistan. She lowered him down as his eyes rolled backward and his breathing turned shallow, gasping. That's when she saw it, the crude bandage under his jacket, soaked through with old blood. She ripped his shirt open and her eyes narrowed. 3 days of bleeding inside, infection risk climbing, and now his breathing was wrong. Too shallow. His lips were already taking on a bluish tint. She looked up at the security guards frozen near the entrance. Ultrasound and pericardiocentesis kit. Now. One of them started. Now, she repeated, and something in her voice made them move. It was the voice of someone who had commanded people in environments where hesitation got you killed. She turned to a wide-eyed medical student huddled behind a counter. Portable monitor, oxygen, and call a code team, but keep them staged outside. Do not let them come in until I tell you. The pistol lay on the floor 6 feet away. Danielle didn't spare it a glance. Her fingers found Marcus's radial pulse, thready, barely there, racing at 138. She placed her stethoscope on his chest and listened. Muffled heart sounds. Distant. Like listening to a heartbeat from underwater. Distant and fading. You've been stabbed, she said, not a question. When? 3 days, he gasped between shallow breaths. Didn't matter. Just wanted him dead. Sure, listen to me. You're bleeding inside. Around your heart. It's called cardiac tamponade. Blood is building up in the pericardium and it's crushing your heart. If I don't drain it in the next 10 minutes, your organs shut down. You understand? He nodded, terrified now in a different way. The kind of fear that comes with understanding. The ultrasound cart rolled up. A nurse had grabbed it. Danielle's hands, steady as surgical lasers, squeezed gel onto Marcus's chest and positioned the probe at the subcostal window. The screen flickered to life. There it was, his heart floating in a black halo of fluid, compressed like a fist closing. The pericardium was distended, the pressure building. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the needle, 18 gauge, 6 inches long, and guided it under ultrasound visualization into the pericardial sac with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times. Not here. Not in a Portland emergency room. But somewhere. The muscle memory was there, buried under 8 years of being invisible. The needle pierced the pericardium and dark blood filled the syringe. Immediately, the fluid drained. The compression released. On the monitor, Marcus's heart rate began to stabilize. His oxygen saturation climbed. 88, 91. 94, his color improved. His breathing deepened. The security guards watched in stunned silence. This quiet nurse who had been ignored and underestimated for 8 years had just walked directly into a gunman's rage and walked out with a saved life. The man screaming for murder 2 minutes ago was now lying on the floor, tears streaming down his face, alive. The code team came rushing through the doors, ready for combat, ready for crisis. They saw Danielle standing over Marcus with the needle still in his hand, his vital signs stabilizing, and they understood immediately. It was already over. The real emergency had already been handled. She peeled off her gloves slowly as they transitioned care, rolling him to a stretcher, prepping him for the operating room where they could do the definitive work, find the stab wound, repair it, address the infection that was probably already setting in. Danielle stepped back and let them work. Her hands were steady until she was alone in the supply room. Then her hands trembled. Not from fear. From the recognition of what she'd just done. From the voice she'd used. From the fact that she hadn't asked for permission. And then her phone rang. The code team rushed in like a blue and white storm, 5 bodies moving in synchronized precision, the stretcher wheels squeaking against polished tile as they surrounded the gunman. Someone shouted for the OR. Someone else was calling for typo negative. Danielle stepped back, peeling latex from her hands, her breathing already returning to baseline. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like cicadas. She watched them move him toward the elevators, watched the doors slide shut, and then the hallway was empty except for the sound of her own footsteps and the steady beep of the heart monitor they'd left behind. That's when she saw him. Dr. Sterling stood 30 feet down the corridor, phone already pressed to his ear, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working. His other hand was balled into a fist at his side. He saw her looking and turned away, but not before she caught the expression on his face, not shock. Calculation. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of control that comes from someone used to power and suddenly aware it's slipping. Yes, I need to report a reckless endangerment incident, he said into the phone. A nurse performed an invasive procedure beyond her scope without physician oversight. Pericardiocentesis. No physician present. No consent form. No supervision whatsoever. Danielle didn't move. She knew what was happening. She'd seen it before, not in hospitals, but in the field. When someone with institutional power realized they'd been exposed, their instinct was always the same: retaliate fast, retaliate hard, retaliate through every channel they controlled. Sterling had board connections. Sterling had influence. Sterling had a network built on 18 years of carefully cultivated relationships at Johns Hopkins and before that. He turned to face her, phone still pressed to his ear, and the look in his eyes was something between fury and hunger. He spoke into the device again. I'll be filing a formal complaint within the hour. Yes. Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate the expedited review. He lowered the phone and walked toward her, each step deliberate, measured, like a predator that had decided the chase was over. My office. Now, he said. Not a request. A command delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to obedience. She followed him down the corridor, past the nurse's station where 3 RNs suddenly became very focused on their computers, past the break room where she knew no one would look up if she walked in. The air smelled like antiseptic and something else, the copper tang of blood still on her hands despite the gloves. His office door closed behind them with a soft click. You just ended your career, Sterling said. He didn't sit. He stood behind his desk like a judge behind a bench, his hands spread flat against the mahogany surface. Pericardiocentesis requires physician supervision. It requires consent. It requires documentation. You performed an invasive procedure on a patient without any of those things, and in doing so, you exposed this hospital to catastrophic liability. He would have died, Danielle said quietly. That is not your determination to make. Sterling's voice dropped to something colder than anger, something closer to contempt. Your job is to follow protocol. Your job is to call a physician. Your job is to assist, not to decide. You've just committed a felony, and I'm removing you from this schedule pending investigation. He opened his laptop with the kind of aggressive efficiency that told her this wasn't improvisation. He'd already decided what he was going to do the moment he'd turned away from the elevators. His fingers moved across the keyboard. She watched his face as he typed, watched the satisfaction settle into the lines around his mouth. This was what he did. This was what he was good at. She understood then that the gunman, the cardiac tamponade, the emergency, all of it had simply been an opportunity. An opening. A way to weaponize her own competence against her. I'm calling the board chair, Sterling said, not looking up from the screen. I'm contacting every reference you've provided on your application. I'm bringing in an outside risk management firm to audit your entire patient file history for the last 3 years. If you've so much as documented a blood pressure incorrectly, we will find it. The next 2 hours moved in a strange, compressed timeline. Danielle was assigned to a temporary assignment on the surgical floor, busy work, meant to be humiliating. She could hear Sterling's voice from his office, crisp and controlled. Yes, I'm calling because I have concerns about one of her prior performance reviews. Have you ever questioned her judgment? Yes, I understand HIPAA restrictions, but as a reference provided by this employee, you're certainly permitted to share your honest perspective. She watched an outside investigator in a grey blazer arrive at 1,245 hours. She watched him set up in a conference room with three of Sterling's board allies, Patricia Langford, the board's financial chair, Michael Chen from Risk Management, and David Ashford, the CEO himself. They were reviewing files. Danielle could see them through the glass partition, could see the investigator making notes on a legal pad, could see Sterling leaning in, pointing at something in a chart, his mouth moving in what looked like a rehearsed explanation of clinical failures. The email came at 1,400 hours. Her phone buzzed in her pocket while she was checking 4 lines on a post-op patient. Suspended without pay, effective immediately. Pending disciplinary hearing. Report to HR for badge collection. She finished checking the 4-line. She documented the vitals. She ensured the patient's call bell was within reach. And then she walked to her locker, opened it, and found the combat boots, the pair from Marjah, worn leather that had walked through dust and blood and years of forgetting. She pressed the boots against her chest, closed her eyes, and walked to her car. The drive home was silent. No music. No radio. Just the sound of tires on wet asphalt. It had rained that morning, the kind of Portland rain that came down soft and relentless, and the sound of her own breathing, which she kept deliberately even, deliberately calm. She couldn't afford to break in the car. Not yet. Emma was in the front yard at 1,420 hours, playing with a jump rope and singing something off-key, the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that only a 7-year-old could produce. She looked up when the car pulled into the driveway, and Danielle watched her daughter's face shift from happiness to confusion as she registered that Mommy wasn't supposed to be home until after dinner. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma asked, running toward the car as Danielle stepped out. "Why are you home early? Are you sick?" Danielle tried to smile. Tried to find the words. Tried to construct some kind of normal explanation that wouldn't terrify a child. But the boot leather was still in her hands, and the boots were from Marjah, and Marjah was a place where people disappeared into black ops and didn't come back, where identities were erased from official record, where you became a ghost so complete that even your own life story became classified. "Go inside, baby," she said, her voice steady but her vision already beginning to blur. "Mommy needs to sit down." She made it to the kitchen table. Emma hovered in the doorway, frightened now, because children could sense a collapse even when adults tried to hide it. Danielle sat down, placed the combat boots on the table, and the tears came, not the controlled, managed tears of someone processing a setback. These were the deep, shaking sobs of someone who understood that everything she'd built, every careful wall she'd constructed between her 2 lives, had just fractured into 1,000 pieces. The operation in Marjah had been classified. The record of her service had been erased. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross officially did not exist. She'd been ordered to disappear, to become just a nurse in Portland, just a quiet woman who showed up, did her job, and asked no questions. To stay invisible. To stay safe. To ensure that her daughter would never have to know what her mother had done, what her mother was capable of, what her mother had survived. But Sterling had left her no choice. He'd forced her into the open. He'd created a situation where she had to act, and in acting, she'd exposed herself, and now the most dangerous part wasn't the career she'd just lost. It was what came next, because the military didn't just declassify records without reason. The Pentagon didn't just suddenly resurrect ghosts. Something was coming. Something had already been set in motion the moment she'd pulled that needle into the gunman's chest. Emma was crying now too, confused and frightened by her mother's collapse. And Danielle sat at the kitchen table in Portland, Oregon, holding the boots from Afghanistan, and understood that her life as an invisible nurse was over. 3 days later, a 52-year-old man arrived at Sacred Heart's emergency entrance with 7 stab wounds and a story no one was prepared to hear. The trauma alert sounded at 2:08 p.m., code trauma, Bay 3, multiple penetrating wounds to the abdomen and chest, vitals unstable, ETA 3 minutes. Danielle was restocking the crash cart when the ambulance bay doors burst open, the rotor wash from a life flight helicopter still shaking the glass. She didn't look up. She just moved, her hands already reaching for the trauma shears hanging from her neck, and walked toward the incoming stretcher like she'd done 10,000 times before. But the moment the man's eyes found her across the controlled chaos of the ER, something shifted in the air pressure of the room itself. His face went white. Whiter than blood loss should make it. His lips moved in a whisper, words in Pashto that no one else in the trauma bay could understand, except Danielle, whose hands went still for exactly 1 second. "The angel of Marjah," he said, his voice like wind through a canyon, hollow and ancient. "I watched you kill 6 of my men to save that child." The trauma team froze. Monitors beeped in the sudden silence. The stretcher wheel squeaked once and stopped. Danielle felt every eye in the ER turn toward her, but she didn't look away from the man bleeding out in front of her. 20 years. 20 years of walking these corridors with a buried past, and the past had just arrived on a stretcher with a stab wound in his spleen. She'd learned to read faces in Marjah, learned it through the scope of a rifle, learned it in the dark of a cave where 6 men had stood between her and an 8-year-old boy. This man's face was a map of grief and recognition and something that looked like forgiveness. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Reeves, not Sterling, thank God Sterling was already gone, started barking orders. "Type and cross, get 2 units, activate massive transfusion protocol, someone get neuro down here." But before anyone moved, a voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Senior Chief Petty Officer." It wasn't a question. Staff Sergeant Lucas Brennan stood in the doorway of the trauma bay, still in his military dress blues from his follow-up appointment, and his voice carried the weight of recognition and something deeper, gratitude, maybe, or the kind of awe you feel when you meet someone who saved your life. The room went dead silent. Even the ventilators seemed to pause. The monitor's steady beep was the only sound, that mechanical pulse like a countdown, like the universe holding its breath. Danielle turned toward him slowly, and everyone in that ER saw the transformation happen in real time. Her shoulders straightened. Her voice, when she spoke, dropped an octave and became something made of steel. "Get him to Bay 3. I'm with trauma." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and the power in those 4 words made Dr. Reeves step aside without argument. She moved to the stretcher with Brennan's mother suddenly at her elbow. She'd been in the waiting room, and now she stood beside her son, watching the nurse she knew become someone else entirely. Danielle's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times in places where mistakes meant death. 18 gauge 4, second stick because the first was blown. Femoral arterial line going in before they even reached the CT scanner. Blood was already hanging, O negative, flowing like liquid urgency, and she was moving through the trauma protocol like water through a broken dam, every motion efficient, every breath measured. But beneath the medical precision, there was something else. She was seeing that 8-year-old boy in the face of this man, and she was seeing the moment in Marjah when she'd chosen to save him instead of following orders. 12 minutes later, they had him stable enough for the OR. Spleen salvaged. No solid organ loss. Vitals climbing, BP now 94/58, O2 sat holding at 92%, heart rate settling from the 140s into the 110s. The kind of climb that meant survival. The kind of climb she'd heard before, in a cave in Helmand Province, when an 8-year-old boy's heart rate had normalized as she'd held pressure on a wound that should have killed him. The surgeon nodded at her. "Good work, Senior Chief." He said it deliberately, formally, and the title hung in the OR like a flag being planted. There was no more hiding. And that's when the doors opened. Not the OR doors. The ER doors. A woman in a charcoal suit and an FBI badge, flanked by a naval officer in dress whites, Commander Hayes, whose call sign had been a breaker when he ran SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Behind them, a man in uniform carrying a red folder, the kind that had classified stamped on every page. The naval investigator placed the folder on the counter in front of Danielle while she was still in her surgical gloves, still covered in blood from a man who'd been her enemy once and something else entirely now. 20 years ago, she'd burned these pages. Or thought she had. The operation in Marjah had been classified so deep that even her CO had said her name would be scrubbed from every record. Black operation. No official existence. No medals because you couldn't acknowledge what you didn't exist to do. But the pages in that red folder were pristine. Photographs. Intelligence summaries. A mission timeline dated March 14, 2004. And a decorations list that made the surgeon step back and the trauma nurses stop moving. Navy Cross, the naval investigator read, his voice like granite in the suddenly quiet OR. The Medal for Extraordinary Heroism in Combat. The third highest combat decoration in the United States Navy. One line for a moment that Danielle had spent 20 years trying to forget, the moment she'd charged 6 armed Taliban through a destroyed schoolhouse because an 8-year-old was still alive on the other side. Silver Star, he continued, and she could hear the weight in his voice, and a second Silver Star for operations in Ghazni province. 2 of them. For missions she'd never told anyone about. For moments when she'd held people's lives in her hands and refused to let them fall. Bronze Star with Valor. For the medical aid station she'd established in Sanjan Valley, treating civilians under fire, operating on wounded with nothing but field supplies and will. And a Navy Cross, he said again, because there could only be one, and it was the one that made Commander Brennan's eyes flood with tears. The ER was a painting frozen in time. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer, and Danielle stood there in surgical gloves and blood and 20 years of buried history, and the silence was so complete you could have heard a stethoscope fall on the tile. Then the FBI agent spoke. Operation Marjah was declassified this morning, she said, and the words hit like a frag grenade. By order of Northcom and the Pentagon. The operation file that was filed under special access programs for 2 decades has been unsealed. And we're here to tell you that you were the first woman to complete a classified Special Forces combat mission embedded in an active theater. Her voice was steady and official, but there was something in it that sounded like respect. The first woman to lead a direct action raid. The first woman to be awarded the Navy Cross for combat operations. The first senior chief. The first. Always the first. Danielle felt her daughter's absence like a physical wound. Emma wasn't here to see this moment, the moment when her mom became something other than a crying woman at a kitchen table. She was home with a babysitter who didn't know that the woman she was watching had held a Marine's intestines in her hands while rounds impacted the wall behind her, and had kept working anyway. But Lucas Brennan was here. And his mother. And the man on the stretcher, the enemy, the refugee, the ghost of Marjah, was alive in the OR because Danielle had made a choice to save him the way she'd chosen to save an 8-year-old boy 20 years ago. There's one more thing, the FBI agent said. The folder opened, and photographs spilled out, Dr. Sterling's emails. Dr. Sterling's phone records. Dr. Sterling's contact with a forger in Seattle. Dr. Sterling's communications with board member Langford, detailing the timeline for Danielle's termination before any investigation could expose his fabrications. Dr. Marcus Sterling attempted to forge Senior Chief Ross's personnel records. He submitted falsified documents to the hospital board. He attempted to commit fraud to conceal his own incompetence. He's under arrest. The words landed like an execution. The FBI agent didn't need to add the detail that Sterling had already been taken into custody that morning, still in his surgical scrubs, still telling the board that Danielle was dangerous. The board had terminated him before lunch. His hospital credentials revoked immediately. His medical license suspended pending state review. His network, the carefully constructed web of Hopkins administrators and consultants and board members who'd promised him advancement, suddenly unavailable to take his calls. The consultants ghosted him. The Hopkins contacts changed their numbers. Board member Langford resigned the next day, his role in the falsification exposed before anyone could protect him. Within 6 weeks, the state medical board issued its final decision. Dr. Marcus Sterling's medical license was revoked permanently. No appeals. No second chances. No redemption. Just gone, the way he'd tried to make Danielle disappear. 3 months later, Danielle was driving past a strip mall on Powell Boulevard, heading home from a double shift at Sacred Heart, when she saw him. Through the window of a storefront office, sitting at a folding table with a banner that read supplemental insurance policies, low rates. He was wearing a cheap polo shirt, the kind sold at Target, and drugstore reading glasses instead of his designer frames. An elderly man was filling out forms in front of him, and Sterling was explaining coverage options in a voice that sounded higher pitched than she remembered, strained, desperate. She slowed her car. Watched for 5 seconds. He looked up, and his face drained of color when he saw her, saw the woman who'd destroyed him by simply existing, by being exactly who she'd always been. Danielle didn't stop. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just drove past, her worn combat boots resting on the passenger seat beside her, the ones from Marjah, the ones that had walked through caves and deserts and the corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital. The ones that had carried her here, to this moment, where everything she'd been and everything she'd hidden had finally become the same thing. 6 months after the reveal, Danielle's photograph hung in Sacred Heart's Hall of Heroes, between a World War II medic and a Vietnam flight nurse. The plaque beneath it read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, USN, Ret, Navy Cross, Silver Star, 2, Bronze Star with Valor, the Angel of Marjah. She walked past it most mornings without stopping, but today Lucas Brennan was waiting beside it with his mother, an older woman with kind eyes and a smile that held 20 years of gratitude. I wanted her to meet you properly, Lucas said, his voice steady. His mother took Danielle's hands, and her grip was warm, real, alive. You saved him twice, she said. Once in Marjah. Once here, by showing him what courage looks like. Emma stood beside her mother, finally understanding why Mommy had come home crying that day, finally seeing the boots in the locker and the shadow box beside them with the decorations, not hidden, not displayed, just there, part of who Danielle was. The former Taliban commander was still recovering in a step-down unit, his wounds healing, his path to citizenship secure after his testimony helped declassify the operation. Bobby Cortez, the gunman Danielle had talked down, had sent her a card from physical therapy, thank you for seeing me as human. He sent her one every month. She read them and kept them in a drawer by her bed. On her way out that evening, she passed the Hall of Heroes again and saw a young nurse standing before her photo, reading the plaque carefully. The nurse didn't notice Danielle watching. She was just standing there, reading the list of medals, understanding that one of the people who walked these hallways, who restocked crash carts and checked monitor leads, who held dying people's hands, one of them had saved lives in ways that most people would never comprehend. Danielle smiled. Her footsteps were steady on the linoleum as she walked past, her stethoscope around her neck, her boots, the ones from Marjah, carrying her toward the exit. The parking lot outside smelled like rain and asphalt, and somewhere in the city, a helicopter was landing on some other hospital's pad, carrying some other trauma that needed hands steady enough to hold it. But here, in Portland, in the quiet corridors of Sacred Heart, everyone was going to be okay. And if you ever find yourself in a hospital, watching a nurse move through a crisis with the kind of grace that comes from having already survived the worst, remember, sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong, please subscribe to see more stories like this one. Like the video, comment below about a time you showed your true strength, and share this with someone who needs to know that heroes walk among us in the quietest ways.